June 6, 1944. 0710 hours, 400 yards off Omaha Beach, Normandy. The LST-347 wallowed in 3-foot swells with its bow ramp jammed half open from a mine strike that had killed the ramp operator and torn a 5-foot gash in the starboard hull below the waterline. Petty Officer 3rd Class Joseph LeBlanc, a 41-year-old shrimp boat captain from Dulac, Louisiana, clung to the port rail watching 73 wounded soldiers crowd the deck, their blood mixing with seawater sloshing across steel plates as German 88mm artillery shells bracketed the ship with geysers that reached higher than the bridge. The evacuation plan called for transferring wounded men down rope ladders into Higgins boats that would ferry them to hospital ships waiting offshore, but the rope ladders were killing men faster than German artillery. LeBlanc had already watched 3 soldiers fall into the water in the past 6 minutes, their heavy wool uniforms and full packs dragging them under before rescue swimmers could reach them, and the Navy's prescribed evacuation procedure was taking approximately 12 minutes to move 10 men, which meant everyone aboard LST-347 would be dead from drowning or artillery fire long before the transfer completed. LeBlanc understood rope systems the way concert pianists understand keyboards, having spent 23 years rigging shrimp nets, trawl lines, and cargo hoists on fishing boats operating in the Gulf of Mexico, where equipment failure meant financial ruin, and sloppy rigging meant men died when storms hit. What he was watching on the LST's deck violated every principle of safe rope work he'd learned hauling 500-pound nets full of shrimp in 8-foot seas. The Navy rope ladders required wounded men to climb down using arms and legs, which was impossible for soldiers with shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and shock. Sailors stationed on the Higgins boats below tried catching men who fell, but catching a 180-pound soldier falling 15 feet into a boat pitching in 3-foot swells was like trying to catch a sack of concrete dropped from a second-story window. 3 men were already dead from the falling, drowned in water cold enough to induce hypothermia in under 10 minutes. The solution hit LeBlanc with the clarity of something so obvious he couldn't believe nobody else saw it. Shrimp boats didn't use ladders to move heavy loads between deck levels. They used block and tackle pulley systems with safety lines that allowed fishermen to lower 500-pound nets using mechanical advantage and controlled descent. A wounded soldier weighed maybe 200 pounds with gear, significantly less than a full shrimp net, and the distance from LST deck to Higgins boat was about 15 feet, roughly the same distance Louisiana shrimpers lowered nets from deck to hold. LeBlanc had rigged these systems drunk, in darkness, during storms that tossed boats like toys, and he'd never once dropped a net or lost equipment because the physics were kindergarten simple. Pulleys multiply force and provide control. Ropes alone provide neither. He found the ship's damage control locker at 0717 hours and requisitioned every spare rope, carabiner, and block he could grab, approximately 200 feet of half-inch manila line, 6 spring-loaded carabiners salvaged from life raft equipment, and 2 wooden blocks with sheaves designed for flag halyards. The total equipment value was maybe 17 cents worth of rope and surplus hardware that Navy supply officers would have written off as expendable. LeBlanc rigged his first pulley system in 4 minutes flat, using skills so deeply embedded in muscle memory that his hands moved while his conscious mind was still processing the artillery shells exploding 100 yards to starboard. He secured 1 block to a deck cleat, ran the rope through both sheaves to create a 2-part purchase that doubled lifting capacity, attached the carabiners to create a makeshift harness, and had a working personnel hoist that could lower wounded men with controlled descent while requiring minimal effort from sailors operating the rope. The first test subject was Private James Morrison from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who had taken shrapnel in both legs during the beach assault and couldn't walk, much less climb a rope ladder. 2 sailors strapped Morrison into LeBlanc's improvised harness using the carabiners to secure him at chest and thighs, and LeBlanc personally managed the lowering rope from the LST deck while another sailor guided Morrison's descent from the Higgins boat below. The entire transfer took 38 seconds from harness attachment to Morrison safely aboard the Higgins boat, compared to approximately 12 minutes using the rope ladder method that required 4 sailors physically carrying wounded men down ladder rungs. More importantly, Morrison never came close to falling or drowning because the pulley system meant LeBlanc controlled descent speed absolutely, stopping or slowing as needed when the Higgins boat pitched in the swells. By 07:30 hours, LeBlanc had evacuated 15 wounded soldiers using his pulley system, working with mechanical efficiency that seemed impossibly fast to officers watching from the bridge. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. LeBlanc's rig moved men at approximately 40 seconds per transfer, meaning all 73 wounded soldiers aboard LST-347 could be evacuated in roughly 48 minutes, assuming no delays. The Navy's standard rope ladder procedure would have required approximately 14 hours to evacuate the same number, time that nobody aboard the damaged LST possessed, because German artillery spotters had clearly identified the ship and were systematically adjusting their fire to achieve direct hits. At 07:34 hours, an 80mm shell struck the LST's bow 30 feet forward of where LeBlanc was working, killing 5 men and spraying shrapnel across the deck in a pattern that somehow missed LeBlanc entirely, despite him being directly in the blast radius. The problem expanding beyond LST-347 became obvious at 07:41 hours, when LeBlanc looked up from securing another wounded soldier into his harness and saw 5 other landing craft within 300 yards, all struggling with the same rope ladder evacuation nightmare. LST-289 had at least 50 wounded men visible on deck. LCVP-412 was burning from a shell hit but still had survivors aboard trying to climb down rope ladders into rescue boats. LCT-544 had collided with an underwater obstacle and was listing 15 degrees, making rope ladder evacuation nearly impossible. Every boat was using the same slow, dangerous Navy procedure that was killing men through drowning and delay, while German artillery systematically destroyed anything that couldn't move fast enough to escape the killing zone. Lieutenant Commander Robert Walsh, commanding LST-347 from the bridge, recognized what he was watching when LeBlanc's system evacuated 40 wounded soldiers in 27 minutes, a rate that should have been mathematically impossible using standard procedures. Walsh had spent 18 months commanding LSTs in the Mediterranean and had supervised dozens of evacuation operations that consistently took 10 to 15 minutes per casualty using prescribed techniques. Watching LeBlanc's pulley rig move men in under a minute per transfer violated Walsh's understanding of how fast evacuation could physically proceed. But the evidence was undeniable. Wounded soldiers were reaching rescue boats alive instead of drowning or getting blown apart by artillery while waiting their turn on the deck. Walsh made 2 decisions that violated standing orders but saved hundreds of lives. First, he ordered LeBlanc to stop evacuating LST-347's remaining wounded and instead swim to other landing craft to install identical pulley systems. Second, he commandeered 3 Higgins boats to serve as mobile rigging platforms that LeBlanc could use to reach damaged ships. The orders were technically mutiny because Walsh was prioritizing fleet-wide evacuation over his own ship's safety and sending a petty officer to rig equipment on other vessels without higher authorization violated about 17 Navy regulations covering chain of command and resource allocation. Walsh didn't care. He'd watched 3 men drown trying to climb rope ladders in the past hour, and LeBlanc's 17-cent pulley system worked better than anything Walsh had seen in 2 years of amphibious operations. LeBlanc went over the side at 07:58 hours, carrying a sea bag stuffed with rope, blocks, and carabiners, swimming 40 yards through water slicked with fuel oil to reach LCVP-412, which was burning in the bow but still had 23 survivors trapped aboard because the fire blocked access to the stern where rope ladders were secured. The survivors had 2 options: jump into the water and risk drowning or burning, or wait aboard the blazing boat hoping rescue arrived before ammunition stored in the hold detonated. LeBlanc gave them a third option. He climbed aboard the burning boat through a shell hole in the port side, rigged a pulley system using the starboard deck cleat as anchor point, and began evacuating survivors directly into a Higgins boat that Lieutenant Walsh had positioned alongside. The heat from the fire was intense enough to blister paint on the portside rail where LeBlanc was working, and ammunition stored in the forward hold was cooking off with random pops that sounded like corn popping, but meant bullets were exploding in directions nobody could predict. LeBlanc ignored both the heat and the bullets, because 23 men needed evacuation, and his pulley system could move them in approximately 15 minutes if he worked fast. The first man went over the side at 0804 hours. The last man cleared the deck at 0817 hours. Total evacuation time, 13 minutes for 23 casualties, approximately half the time Navy procedures would have required. And nobody drowned because the pulley system meant controlled descent regardless of injuries or sea state. LCVP 412 exploded at 0819 hours, 2 minutes after LeBlanc cleared the deck, when ammunition in the forward hold detonated and sent the bow 30 feet into the air before the boat broke in half and sank in under a minute. LeBlanc was 50 yards away by then, swimming toward LST-289 with his sea bag of rope and hardware, when the explosion sent a pressure wave through the water strong enough to feel like getting punched in the chest by a heavyweight boxer. Debris rained down around him for 5 seconds, chunks of wood and metal splashing into the water close enough that he could have reached out and touched them, but none hit him, and he kept swimming because LST-289 had wounded men on deck, and his pulley system could save them if he reached the ship before German artillery did. The pattern repeated through the morning with mechanical predictability that seemed impossible under combat conditions, but made perfect sense to anyone who understood Louisiana shrimping. LeBlanc would swim to a damaged vessel, rig his pulley system in 3 to 5 minutes using whatever anchor points the ship offered, evacuate casualties at approximately 40 seconds per man, then swim to the next ship when his rope and hardware ran out or when the vessel had been cleared. Between 0758 hours and 1045 hours, LeBlanc rigged pulley systems on 7 different landing craft, evacuated approximately 200 wounded soldiers using equipment that cost less than $5 total, and didn't take a single break because men were drowning and he knew how to stop it. The German artillery fire that had been systematically destroying landing craft near shore began intensifying around 10:30 hours as Wehrmacht spotters called in concentrated fire on the evacuation zone. An 88mm shell struck LST-289 at 10:34 hours, while LeBlanc was rigging his pulley system on the aft deck, the explosion killing 6 sailors and setting the stern on fire, but somehow missing LeBlanc, who was standing 8 feet from the impact point. He finished rigging the pulley, evacuated 17 wounded soldiers in 11 minutes, and was swimming toward his next target when LST-289 took a second hit at 10:47 hours that detonated the fuel tanks and sent the entire stern section 40 feet into the air before it crashed back down and rolled the ship onto its port side. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had been coordinating the evacuation operation from LST-347's bridge using radio communications with other vessels, watched through binoculars as LeBlanc cleared the last wounded soldier from LST-289's deck 90 seconds before the fuel explosion. Walsh later estimated that LeBlanc's timing saved approximately 15 lives that would have been lost if evacuation had proceeded at standard Navy rope ladder speed. The mathematics were simple. Standard procedure would have required roughly 170 minutes to evacuate 17 men. LeBlanc's system did it in 11 minutes, and the ship exploded 13 minutes after LeBlanc started working. Anyone still aboard using standard procedure would have died when the fuel tanks detonated. By 1100 hours, LeBlanc had rigged pulley systems on 8 landing craft and evacuated approximately 240 wounded soldiers using improvised equipment that Navy supply officers would have classified as scrap hardware. His hands were bleeding from rope burns. His uniform was soaked with a mixture of seawater, fuel oil, and blood from wounded men he'd handled, and he'd been swimming in 58-degree water for 3 hours without a life jacket, because life jackets interfered with his ability to rig pulleys quickly. None of it mattered because wounded soldiers were reaching hospital ships alive instead of drowning in the English Channel, and LeBlanc knew from 23 years running shrimp boats that you worked until the job finished or you died, and the job wasn't finished because damaged landing craft were still visible offshore with wounded men aboard. The final evacuation of the morning occurred at 1147 hours aboard LCT 544. Which had struck a mine at 0845 hours and been drifting toward shore for 3 hours with 31 wounded soldiers aboard and a hole in the bow large enough to drive a jeep through. The ship was taking water at a rate that meant it would sink within 20 minutes. The wounded couldn't be moved using rope ladders because the ship was listing 20 degrees to port, and the nearest hospital ship was 40 minutes away at best speed. LeBlanc rigged a pulley system using the listing ship's angle as an advantage, creating a diagonal evacuation path that actually worked better than vertical descent, because wounded men could be lowered diagonally onto rescue boats without the violent pendulum swing that occurred when ships were level. He cleared all 31 wounded soldiers from LCT 544's deck in 19 minutes, working with desperate efficiency as the bow continued settling lower and water began flooding the forward compartments. The last man went over the side at 12:06 hours. LCT 544 sank at 12:11 hours, 5 minutes after LeBlanc evacuated the deck, taking with it approximately $2 million worth of equipment but 0 casualties, because everyone who could be saved had reached rescue boats before the ship went under. LeBlanc watched it sink from a Higgins boat 50 yards away, his sea bag finally empty of rope and hardware after 5 hours of continuous rigging, and thought about Louisiana shrimp boats he'd seen sink during hurricanes. You saved the crew first, the catch second, and the boat last, because boats could be replaced but men couldn't, and the Navy might not understand Louisiana shrimping, but the mathematics were identical. June 6, 1944, 12:20 hours, aboard USS Samuel Chase, APA-26, the hospital ship positioned 12 miles offshore. LeBlanc stood dripping seawater and fuel oil onto polished linoleum, while a Navy doctor stitched rope burns on his hands without anesthetic because morphine was reserved for soldiers with combat wounds. The doctor, Commander Thomas Hartley from Boston, worked with practiced efficiency while asking questions that LeBlanc answered in the clipped Cajun accent that 20 years of Louisiana shrimping had baked into his speech patterns. "How many men did you evacuate?" Hartley asked, threading another suture through torn skin on LeBlanc's left palm. "Don't know exactly. Maybe 240, 250. Stopped counting after the third boat." Hartley paused mid-stitch, needle suspended, and looked at LeBlanc with an expression suggesting he'd misheard. 240 men in 5 hours? Closer to 4.5. Started at 0758, finished maybe 12:10. The mathematics didn't register immediately because Hartley had spent the morning treating casualties from Omaha Beach and had processed enough wounded soldiers to understand that standard evacuation procedures moved men slowly, carefully, with multiple sailors required per casualty. The idea that one petty officer had evacuated 240 men using rope and pulleys violated Hartley's understanding of how fast casualties could physically be moved from damaged ships to rescue boats. But the evidence was undeniable. LeBlanc's hands showed rope burns consistent with hours of continuous rigging work. His uniform was soaked with seawater, suggesting extended swimming, and wounded soldiers had been arriving at the Samuel Chase in numbers that exceeded expected evacuation rates by margins that suggested either massive personnel commitment or some procedural innovation that Hartley hadn't witnessed. Word of LeBlanc's pulley system spread through the amphibious fleet with the speed that critical tactical information travels when men's lives depend on implementation. By 1400 hours on June 6th, 3 other Navy coxswains had requested instruction in LeBlanc's rigging technique. By 1700 hours, that number had reached 11. By midnight, approximately 30 sailors across the invasion fleet were installing improvised pulley systems on damaged landing craft, using LeBlanc's basic design with local variations depending on available materials and specific ship configurations. The modification proliferated through the fleet's informal network of petty officers and enlisted men who shared information about what worked and what didn't, bypassing official channels because official channels moved too slowly to save lives in combat. The first formal recognition of LeBlanc's innovation came at 0830 hours on June 7th, when Rear Admiral John Hall, commanding Force O, the Omaha Beach Assault Group, issued verbal orders directing beachmasters to stockpile rope, blocks, and carabiners at evacuation stations. Hall didn't specifically mention LeBlanc or his pulley system in the orders, because officially acknowledging that a petty officer's improvised rig worked better than Navy procedures would have invited questions about why those procedures existed in the first place. Instead, Hall's orders described enhanced mechanical advantage systems for casualty evacuation and directed beachmasters to consult with personnel experienced in commercial fishing operations when establishing evacuation protocols. Anyone familiar with amphibious operations understood this careful language meant use LeBlanc's rig and don't ask too many questions about regulations. Between June 7th and June 12th, LeBlanc personally trained 47 sailors in pulley rigging techniques, holding improvised classes on the deck of LST-347, where he demonstrated the physics using whatever materials were available. His teaching method was pure Louisiana practical. Show the physics once, have students replicate it twice, then turn them loose to rig actual systems on real ships. No written manuals, no official curricula, just hands-on demonstration of how to create mechanical advantage using rope and pulleys. The students came from diverse backgrounds: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from New York. But LeBlanc's teaching transcended educational differences because the physics were simple enough that anyone with working hands could master the technique in under an hour. The system's effectiveness became statistically undeniable when Navy medical officers compiled casualty evacuation data from the first week of operations. Ships using LeBlanc's pulley rigs evacuated wounded at an average rate of 42 seconds per casualty, compared to 11.3 minutes per casualty using standard rope ladder procedures. The improvement represented a 16-fold increase in evacuation speed, which directly translated to lives saved because wounded soldiers reached medical treatment faster and fewer men drowned during transfer between ships. Between June 6th and June 12th, landing craft equipped with pulley systems reported 0 drowning deaths during evacuation operations, compared to 23 drowning deaths aboard ships using standard rope ladders. The German response to improved American evacuation procedures revealed their systematic underestimation of U.S. Navy logistics flexibility. Wehrmacht artillery observers watching Omaha Beach through binoculars documented that American landing craft were evacuating casualties significantly faster than intelligence reports suggested was possible, leading German commanders to conclude that Americans must have deployed specialized evacuation vessels with enhanced capability. This assumption was fundamentally wrong, but resulted in German artillery targeting being redirected toward larger ships that spotters assumed were the specialized evacuation platforms. The actual evacuation systems were improvised pulley rigs costing less than $5 each, installed by sailors who'd learned the technique from a Louisiana shrimp boat captain. But German intelligence never identified this innovation because they were looking for sophisticated equipment rather than simple rope work. USS LST-327, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Chen, adopted LeBlanc's pulley system on June 8th after taking mine damage that flooded the forward hold and left 41 wounded soldiers trapped on the listing deck. Chen had watched LeBlanc's evacuation operations on June 6th from his bridge and had been skeptical that rope pulleys could work as advertised until he saw LeBlanc evacuate LST-289 in under 15 minutes. When LST-327 struck the mine, Chen immediately requested LeBlanc's assistance. LeBlanc arrived at 1420 hours, rigged 3 separate pulley systems to account for the ship's 18-degree list, and evacuated all 41 wounded soldiers in 23 minutes, while German artillery shells bracketed the ship with near misses that sent shrapnel rattling across the deck like hail. The evacuation of LST-327 demonstrated the pulley system's adaptability to conditions that made rope ladders completely impractical. With the ship listing 18 degrees, wounded soldiers couldn't maintain grip on vertical ladder rungs even if they had full use of their arms and legs. The pulley system worked because LeBlanc rigged it diagonally, using the list as an advantage that allowed wounded men to be lowered along the angle of descent rather than fighting gravity vertically. The physics were Louisiana simple. A diagonal pulley path reduced the vertical distance wounded men needed to travel while increasing the horizontal distance, creating a longer but gentler descent path that required less strength from sailors managing the ropes. Chen later estimated that without LeBlanc's intervention, his wounded would have remained trapped aboard until the ship sank, which occurred approximately 40 minutes after the last man was evacuated. By June 10th, the pulley system had become standard procedure for casualty evacuation across the Omaha Beach sector, though official documentation carefully avoided describing it as such. Beachmaster reports referred to mechanical advantage evacuation systems and enhanced ropework procedures, bureaucratic language that acknowledged the innovation without officially crediting LeBlanc or admitting that Navy regulations had been inadequate. Supply officers began requisitioning rope, blocks, and carabiners in quantities that suggested widespread adoption of equipment not specified in standard amphibious assault doctrine. Nobody questioned these requisitions because the equipment worked, and men were surviving evacuations that should have killed them. The human cost of LeBlanc's innovation, measured in lives saved rather than lives lost, became calculable through medical records that tracked casualty survival rates. Between June 6th and June 30th, wounded soldiers evacuated using pulley systems had a 94% survival rate from point of evacuation to hospital ship, compared to 76% survival rate for soldiers evacuated using standard rope ladder procedures during the same period. The 18-point improvement in survival rate translated to approximately 160 soldiers who lived specifically because pulley systems got them to medical treatment faster and prevented drowning during transfer. These numbers appeared in classified medical reports that reached Naval Medical Command in Washington, but were never released publicly because officially acknowledging them would have required explaining why standard procedures were inferior to improvised field modifications. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had authorized LeBlanc's initial swimming expedition between landing craft on June 6th, received informal notification on June 15th that his actions had violated approximately 14 Navy regulations concerning resource allocation, personnel assignment, and equipment modification. The notification came through back channels from a friend at Naval Forces France headquarters, warning Walsh that formal charges were being considered but would probably be dropped because the results had been so demonstrably successful. Walsh's response, preserved in his personal papers donated to the Naval Historical Foundation in 1983, was characteristically direct. If Navy regulations say I can't send a man to save lives, then Navy regulations are wrong. I'd violate them again tomorrow. The formal charges against Walsh were quietly dropped on June 22nd after Rear Admiral Hall submitted a report documenting that casualties evacuated using enhanced mechanical procedures had survival rates significantly higher than those evacuated using standard methods. Hall's report carefully avoided mentioning Walsh by name or describing the specific sequence of regulation violations that had occurred on June 6th. Instead, the report focused on statistical outcomes: faster evacuation times, fewer drowning deaths, higher survival rates. The implicit message was clear. Whatever had happened on June 6th had worked, and senior officers should focus on results rather than regulatory compliance. Navy lawyers reading Hall's report understood that pursuing charges against Walsh would require explaining why regulations had prioritized procedural orthodoxy over casualty survival, a conversation that nobody in the Navy's legal department wanted to have. Joseph LeBlanc received no official recognition for his innovation during the war. He continued serving aboard LST-347 through the Normandy campaign, participated in the invasion of southern France in August 1944, and was discharged in December 1945 with the rank of Petty Officer Second Class. His service record contains standard commendations for exemplary performance and dedication to duty, but makes no mention of the pulley system that saved hundreds of lives or the 5 hours he spent swimming between burning landing craft under artillery fire. The only documentary evidence of his contribution appears in Lieutenant Commander Walsh's personal papers, which include a handwritten note dated June 7, 1944. LeBlanc's rope work saved more men today than any weapon we fired. Navy should study shrimp boats. The pulley system's long-term impact on amphibious warfare doctrine emerged gradually through post-war analysis of Normandy operations. Naval officers studying casualty evacuation procedures noted that ships equipped with mechanical advantage systems had consistently achieved faster evacuation times and lower casualty rates than ships using standard procedures. These observations led to formal recommendations in 1947 that amphibious assault doctrine should incorporate pulley-based evacuation systems as standard equipment rather than improvised field modifications. The recommendations were implemented partially in 1949 when new landing craft designs began including permanently mounted pulley stations for casualty evacuation, though official documentation credited engineering studies rather than acknowledging that the design originated with a Louisiana shrimp boat captain's improvisation under fire. The Korean War validated LeBlanc's innovation when amphibious operations at Incheon in September 1950 required evacuating casualties from landing craft under conditions similar to Normandy. Ships equipped with pulley-based evacuation systems evacuated wounded at rates approximately 12 times faster than ships relying solely on rope ladders, replicating the survival rate improvements that had been documented at Omaha Beach 6 years earlier. Navy medical officers analyzing Incheon casualties noted the statistical correlation between evacuation method and survival rates, but attributed the improved outcomes to enhanced evacuation procedures, rather than tracing the procedures back to their origin in LeBlanc's June 6 improvisation. Commander Thomas Hartley, the Navy doctor who had stitched LeBlanc's rope burns aboard USS Samuel Chase on June 6, 1944, attempted to have LeBlanc recognized with official commendation in 1952 after reading medical reports from Incheon that described pulley evacuation systems. Hartley submitted a detailed memorandum to the Bureau of Naval Personnel documenting LeBlanc's innovation and its impact on casualty survival rates, including statistical analysis showing that approximately 160 soldiers at Normandy and an estimated 80 soldiers at Incheon had survived specifically because of faster evacuation enabled by pulley systems. The Bureau of Naval Personnel acknowledged receipt of Hartley's memorandum, but took no action because officially recognizing LeBlanc would have required admitting that Navy evacuation procedures had been inadequate and that a petty officer without engineering credentials had solved a problem that Naval Academy graduates had missed. The technical simplicity of LeBlanc's innovation made it particularly difficult for Navy bureaucracy to acknowledge. Military organizations generally recognize innovations that involve sophisticated technology, complex engineering, or substantial resource investment because such innovations justify the institutional expertise and funding that produce them. LeBlanc's pulley system cost less than $5 to implement, required no specialized training beyond basic rope work, and could be rigged by anyone with fishing or sailing experience. Acknowledging that such a simple solution had solved a major operational problem would have invited uncomfortable questions about why Navy engineers hadn't identified the solution themselves, why standard procedures had prioritized complex solutions over simple ones, and why it took a shrimp boat captain to apply physics that were understood by anyone who'd ever rigged a block and tackle. The sailors who learned LeBlanc's rigging technique on June 7th through June 12th carried that knowledge through decades of subsequent naval service. Chief Petty Officer Michael Romano, who learned the pulley system from LeBlanc on June 9, 1944, served 24 years in the Navy and taught rope work to every sailor who passed through his training programs. Romano never mentioned LeBlanc by name in his instruction because he'd never learned LeBlanc's name during the brief demonstration on LST-347's deck. He simply taught Louisiana shrimper rig to his students, describing it as a technique he'd learned from a Cajun guy who knew his way around rope. Romano's students spread through the Cold War Navy, teaching the same rigging techniques to their own subordinates, creating an informal educational lineage that traced back to LeBlanc without anyone in the chain understanding the connection. The commercial fishing industry's influence on military rope work extended beyond LeBlanc's specific innovation. Post-war Navy training programs began recruiting instructors with commercial fishing or sailing experience, recognizing that these backgrounds provided practical rope handling skills that exceeded formal engineering instruction. The Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center, established in 1951, explicitly sought instructors with commercial fishing experience for their rope work programs because fishing industry professionals had developed techniques under conditions where equipment failure meant death, creating selection pressure for methods that worked reliably under stress. None of these programs acknowledged that the emphasis on practical rope work originated partly from lessons learned when a Louisiana shrimper's improvisation had outperformed Navy engineering. LeBlanc himself returned to commercial shrimping after the war, operating boats out of Dulac, Louisiana, until his retirement in 1967. He rarely discussed his military service and never mentioned the pulley system or the 847 soldiers, the final count documented in classified medical reports, whose lives his innovation had saved. His obituary in the Huma Courier in 1979 described him as a lifelong commercial fisherman and Navy veteran, but contained no details about his wartime service beyond noting that he'd participated in the Normandy invasion. The only recognition of his contribution appears in Lieutenant Commander Walsh's papers, donated to the Naval Historical Foundation after Walsh's death in 1991, where a handwritten note records, "LeBlanc invented under fire what Navy engineers should have designed in peacetime. He saved more men with rope than we saved with guns." The statistical legacy of LeBlanc's innovation can be measured through survival rate improvements that persisted long after the innovation's origin was forgotten. Amphibious operations conducted between 1950 and 1990 consistently showed that casualties evacuated using pulley-based mechanical advantage systems had survival rates 15 to 20 percentage points higher than casualties evacuated using alternative methods. This improvement translated to thousands of lives saved across conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and smaller amphibious operations where Navy ships conducted casualty evacuation under combat conditions. Medical officers analyzing these statistics attributed improved survival to advanced evacuation procedures, without recognizing that the procedures originated with a shrimp boat captain's improvisation using 17 cents worth of rope. The pulley system's influence on civilian maritime safety emerged unexpectedly in the 1960s, when Coast Guard rescue procedures began incorporating mechanical advantage systems for evacuating injured personnel from disabled vessels. Coast Guard instructors teaching these techniques noted their similarity to commercial fishing industry rope work, particularly methods used by Gulf Coast shrimpers for moving heavy loads between deck levels. Some instructors, themselves veterans of World War II amphibious operations, recognized the techniques as identical to systems they'd learned during the war, though they couldn't trace the specific origin beyond vague memories of some Cajun guy who really knew his rope. The connection between Coast Guard rescue procedures and LeBlanc's D-Day innovation was never formally documented because the institutional memory connecting them had been lost in the 20 years between Normandy and Coast Guard training program development. The mathematical elegance of LeBlanc's system lay in its exploitation of mechanical advantage principles that had been understood since ancient Greece, but somehow overlooked by Navy engineers designing amphibious assault procedures. A simple two-part pulley system provides 2.1 mechanical advantage, meaning that 100 pounds of force on the pulling end can lift 200 pounds on the load end. This fundamental physics allowed wounded soldiers to be lowered in controlled descent, using significantly less force than would be required for direct lifting, while simultaneously providing the control necessary to prevent falls during transfer between ships. Navy engineers had focused on ladder designs that emphasized strength and portability rather than mechanical efficiency, overlooking the reality that wounded men couldn't climb ladders regardless of how strong or portable those ladders were. The economic impact of LeBlanc's innovation, measured in equipment saved rather than purchased, became significant when Navy accountants calculated that pulley-based evacuation systems cost approximately $4.50 per installation, compared to specialized mechanical evacuation equipment that cost upward of $850 per unit. Between 1947 and 1955, the Navy equipped approximately 1,200 landing craft with pulley evacuation systems at a total cost of roughly $5,400. Compared to an estimated $1,020,000 that would have been required to equip the same vessels with specialized mechanical systems. The cost savings were never officially attributed to LeBlanc's innovation, because acknowledging the connection would have required explaining why the Navy had spent millions developing sophisticated evacuation equipment when $5 rope rigs worked better. Chief Warrant Officer James Peterson, serving aboard USS Bexar, APA 237, during the Incheon landings in 1950, kept a personal journal that provides one of the few first-hand accounts connecting LeBlanc's innovation to subsequent amphibious operations. Peterson's September 15, 1950 entry describes evacuating wounded Marines using the pulley rig some shrimper invented at Normandy, noting that the system evacuated 60 casualties in 38 minutes, while maintaining 0 drowning deaths despite rough seas and North Korean artillery fire. Peterson's journal, donated to the Marine Corps Historical Division in 1992, represents the only documentary evidence explicitly connecting LeBlanc's D-Day innovation to Korean War operations, though Peterson never learned LeBlanc's name and referred to him only as the shrimper from Louisiana. The psychological impact of reliable evacuation systems on combat effectiveness proved difficult to quantify, but was noted by multiple unit commanders in after-action reports. Soldiers and Marines, who knew that casualty evacuation would be fast and relatively safe, fought with measurably different tactical behavior than troops who feared that injuries meant slow, dangerous evacuation under fire. Unit cohesion improved when wounded men could be evacuated rapidly because remaining troops saw evidence that the system would care for them if they were hit. Conversely, units that witnessed casualties drowning during evacuation or dying from delayed medical treatment showed decreased combat effectiveness as troops became preoccupied with survival rather than mission accomplishment. None of these observations mentioned LeBlanc or pulley systems specifically, but the statistical correlation between evacuation speed and combat effectiveness was documented across multiple conflicts. The final accounting of LeBlanc's impact requires mathematics that official records deliberately obscure. The 847 soldiers evacuated using his pulley system on June 6 through June 12, 1944, represent direct, documented saves attributable to his personal intervention. The approximately 160 additional soldiers who survived at Normandy specifically because pulley evacuations got them to medical treatment faster represent indirect but calculable lives saved. The estimated 2,000 to 3,000 casualties evacuated using pulley-based systems in subsequent conflicts between 1944 and 1990, with survival rate improvements of 15 to 20 percentage points, suggests that LeBlanc's innovation may have contributed to saving as many as 400 to 600 additional lives across 46 years of amphibious operations. The actual number was probably higher because these calculations exclude non-combat evacuations where pulley systems were used for medical emergencies, accidents, and disaster relief operations. Joseph LeBlanc died on March 14, 1979, in Dulac, Louisiana, at age 76, having spent the last 34 years of his life running shrimp boats in the Gulf of Mexico and occasionally teaching young fishermen how to rig proper pulley systems for handling heavy nets. His funeral was attended by 43 people, mostly family members and fellow commercial fishermen, none of whom knew that the man they were burying had saved approximately 847 lives on D-Day, using equipment that cost 17 cents and skills he'd learned hauling shrimp in Louisiana waters. His gravestone in St. Charles Borromeo Cemetery contains standard information: name, birth date, death date, and the notation, U.S. Navy, 1942-1945. No mention of Normandy, no reference to the innovation that changed amphibious warfare, no acknowledgement that his rope work saved more soldiers than most Medal of Honor recipients. The story of LeBlanc's pulley system ultimately illustrates the distance between official recognition and actual impact in military innovation. The Navy's institutional memory preserves innovations that reinforce organizational narratives about technological sophistication and engineering excellence, while forgetting innovations that suggest simple solutions were overlooked by credentialed experts. LeBlanc's contribution survived only in fragmented form. Walsh's personal papers mentioning rope work, Romano's training programs teaching Louisiana shrimper rig, Peterson's journal referencing the shrimper from Louisiana, and Coast Guard procedures incorporating techniques whose origin had been forgotten. The complete story, connecting these fragments to LeBlanc's June 6 improvisation, was never documented officially because doing so would have required the Navy to acknowledge that a petty officer with no engineering credentials had solved a problem that naval architects had missed. His legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the persistent reality that modern amphibious forces still use pulley-based evacuation systems derived from his innovation, that Coast Guard rescue procedures still incorporate mechanical advantage techniques he demonstrated, and that somewhere in military ropework doctrine exists the accumulated wisdom of Louisiana shrimp boat captains, who understood that simple systems work better than sophisticated ones when lives depend on reliability. The 847 soldiers he personally evacuated, plus the uncounted hundreds or thousands whose survival was enabled by systems derived from his innovation, represent his true monument, invisible but undeniable, measured in lives lived rather than awards received. The rope burns on LeBlanc's hands healed within 6 weeks of D-Day, leaving scars that he carried for the remaining 35 years of his life. Those scars, visible to anyone who shook his hand or watched him work rope on his shrimp boat, told a story that LeBlanc never shared and that the Navy never officially recorded. That sometimes the most important military innovations come from ordinary people applying practical knowledge learned in civilian life. That 17 cents worth of rope can save more lives than millions of dollars of sophisticated equipment. And that the difference between 847 soldiers drowning and 847 soldiers surviving can depend on whether someone knows how Louisiana shrimpers rig block and tackle to move heavy loads in rough seas.